What's up, YouTube? It's your girl Viv. I am making a video. I had a really interesting. I've been having a really interesting conversation with a couple of guys. Guy's name is Paul Elam on the left, and Mr. Shaw on the right. Paul Elam is a foundational member of the online men's rights community. Men's Rights Activism MRA, and Mr. Shaw is contributing some very interesting information to the conversation, and it just happens to be a topic that I'm mildly familiar with as well, and that I find interesting. I don't always make a lot of content, and I understand that I haven't made a video like this before, so this may be a little bit choppy, but we should be able to get through it. And I am recording it, so I'm going to try to edit some things out of this video if anything's weird or doesn't really make a lot of sense, but hopefully we don't have to do too much chopping and dropping here. So without further ado, we are going to react to this video, the discussion, what she brings to the table. Just a real caveat here before anybody gets upset, which I don't know if anybody's even going to see this video, so I don't know if anybody's going to be upset or not, but I am trying to have this conversation with women. This particular topic and many topics related to men's rights and the dynamics between men and women, if they're being had at all, are being had by men. And the women that do see them do tend to get a little upset. But ladies, please keep in mind that it is not my intention to attack, accuse, or single any individual female out. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Hey folks, back here with Shaw again, and picking up on our last conversation, which I enjoyed very much. I've been looking forward to this one. We've been talking about marriage and marriage traditions historically, talking a lot about concepts like bride price and dowry. And I think as we examine these things, one of the things that occurs to me is that all of our traditions, except for the romantic tradition, which is sort of a different animal that comes in to, I think, turn over the apple cart for marriage. But other than the romantic tradition, there is something about perceived value playing a role here in all of these arrangements.
I know a lot of you ladies that may watch this are going to feel incensed because you've been told some very questionable and inaccurate things about concepts like arranged marriage and women being chattel and inheritance and basically what it is that women are told we are owed and entitled to in a relationship versus what a man actually is owed and entitled to in a relationship. And by relationship, I'm not talking about dating. I'm not talking about friends with benefits. I'm not talking about girlfriend, boyfriend. I'm not talking about situationships. There are a lot of women who have learned the hard way to amend their ways, and there are a lot of women who have not yet entered the quote-unquote sexual marketplace, as well as many women who have been able to leverage their position in the sexual marketplace in order to secure spouses. Maybe this is just a completely generic conversation about the concept of traditional versus legitimately traditional marriage, which is in fact the only legitimate relationship status there is between a man and a woman who are not otherwise related to one another. So there is a previous video to this discussion, what she brings to the table. And if you can stomach it, ladies, I would really, really suggest you watch it because it is fascinating. All right, let's get back into this.
It's bride price or dowry. I know later, and dowry was practiced even in the West up until like the early 20th century. They called it a marriage portion so that they didn't have to use the word dowry. But it was still the same thing, same tradition. But all of it was based on sort of what do you bring to the table. If you bring assets that are great or labor that's good, then that's recognized in the marital agreement. And so I wanted just to pick up on that theme now, because it seems to me, Shah, that what we've lost, particularly in the West, is any notion of bringing value to the table other than what a man produces.
That's exactly true. And, just to your point about dowry being practiced up until relatively recently, dowry was formally outlawed in Greece in 1983. So that's really not that long ago.
Okay, so I don't know. I hope you caught that. Dowry in the country of Greece, which this is a modern society that we would consider part of the developed world, if not Western culture, didn't outlaw the dowry. And keep in mind that they outlawed it. It wasn't just something that faded out of cultural relevance as a trend. It was barred from being practiced via state intervention on purpose with intent. In 1983. 1983 was 41 years ago. 41 years ago. Now, this brings into question, how are we looking at other examples of, say, arranged marriage and dowry and bride price in modern society, and saying that this practice is from the Stone Age, when clearly in the late 20th century it was still widely practiced in many regions of the Western world, not just Greece. This is just the example that's being cited in this particular conversation. So let's continue.
And in Cyprus, it was formally outlawed in 1991. So it's some of these places are very, very recently. It effectively ends in like Britain, I think, in like late 1800s. So they're kind of the first to start incorporating romantic love and all these kinds of things.
Do you know what prompted, I don't want to take you too far down a side trip, but I'm wondering if you know what prompted them to criminalize dowry in places like Greece and Cyprus.
Well, so I've been running up that, just going down that rabbit hole. And from what I can see, a lot of it, so in 1983, Greece outlaws dowry. In 1981, they joined the EU. So that's just 2 years before. And part of, becoming part of that space is, I guess, updating their laws to be more modernized. And this includes things like, laws for women's rights and incorporating feminism and these kinds of other things into it. Now, specifically, Cyprus and Greece. Cyprus, I don't know if it's part of the EU yet. It at least was not back then. But both Cyprus and Greece were part of the UN and part of the Council of Europe. And I was actually just looking at this earlier, but there was something called the Convention of, it was to help establish women's rights, basically.
You're talking about the Convention of Istanbul?
No, I have it. I got it right here. It's the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So the United Nations and Council of Europe were influenced by conventions like this. And then in turn, Greece and Cyprus, being member states of these other organizations, would then in turn be pressured to kind of fit in with some of the values being pushed in this way. And
so I find it very interesting that they use this terminology to pass these laws, and they've done it all over the world, even in America, claiming that women are victims of this dowry system. And we've all heard it our whole lives, ladies, haven't we? That women are chattel, that their husbands owned them, that they didn't have rights to property, and on and on and on and on and on. But logically, and not a dig against women, but a lot of women, they don't have the greatest grasp of logic. And I'm not saying that I do either. I am female. I have my moments where sometimes the light is shining bright and sometimes it's not. You get a little ditzy here and there every once in a while. Okay. But isn't it strange that even though you don't have rights to property, under a dowry system, you would still bring property into a marriage or receive property from your prospective spouse in the event that you were able to secure a marriage contract? You would be receiving property from the husband or the husband's family, or your family would be contributing property to your new burgeoning family, and they'll discuss what kind of property that usually entailed as we get into this talk. But how is it that you cannot own property and yet you are transacting a marriage by exchanging property on behalf of your own self as a woman? Like, can we make this make sense, right? Let's see if we can suss this out a little bit. And this is kind of difficult to do because I'm the only woman that is, having this conversation. Now, granted, there are other women who understand this concept. Those women tend to be from a specific demographic of people who happen to be religious. It's not widely practiced in the Christian world, but these women happen to be religious. And they have full understanding, and they don't consider it to be the same. They don't look at it through the same lens as non-religious, secular, atheistic, or agnostic Western progressive mentality women do. So that's basically what I'm saying. What I'm basically trying to say is that, we have a real disconnect between what we've been told in the West, that women are property and couldn't own property, versus the reality and the historical fact that women were actually receiving and giving property on behalf of themselves and their families in this system that we consider to be stone aged, but was actually being practiced up until the 80s and the 90s of the last century, which is 30 or 40 years. I hope you're picking up what I'm putting down.
And Greece has a lot of, you can say, incentive wanting to be part of the EU. And it's kind of interesting. I was just looking at this. I can share my screen, but if you look at Greece's, because you remember Greece defaulted back in I can't remember when it was, like 2010 or something like that. And in 1981, when it joined the EU, its balance sheet looked pretty good, And then as it joins the EU, the way I'm seeing it, my perspective is that it's compelled by a lot of these greater, more, I don't know if you'd call them globalist, but just these larger multinational organizations.
You can call them globalists, yeah.
Yeah, that's basically pushing these values onto them, but it's kind of a carrot stick approach, because there's economic incentives for them to be part of these larger groups. Unfortunately, I don't think anybody could have predicted what doing this would have caused down the line for these countries,
So they have criminalized that, and I guess it's not in practice anymore. Practically speaking, for most places in the West, we don't have any more dowry or bride price. I know it still happens in Eastern countries quite a bit, but we don't have it here. And I think that's largely attributable to the romantic model coming in mid-1800s, thereabouts, just about really started hitting its stride in changing marriage from a business arrangement between two families to a romantic arrangement between a man and a woman.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Well, so there's a paper. Actually, Peter Wright found this paper, and he provided it to me. And it was written in 1975, and it's called the function of the dowry. Uh, the function of the dowry system in a rapidly modernizing society. So this is written in 1975, and in the paper, he discusses basically how the traditional dowry system is in Cyprus, and then he goes into how modernization changes things over there, and then he talks about romantic love's influence in them moving away. The younger generations basically moving away, because a lot of these younger generations start leaving the country to go get educated, in places like Britain and just other places in Europe that have already been exposed to, romantic love. So a lot of them come back in with these ideas, to do that. And modernization is incentivizing a lot of people to abandon their traditional ways of living, because instead they're wanting to pursue education, get jobs. The women are doing the same. So at the age where they would have gotten married, what happens is they end up, being away for college for 4 years, kind of being inundated with ideas of romantic love. And
Well, plus they come back with pink hair and ideas of world communism.
Exactly. If you'd like.
So I'd like to just add my little 2 cents in there. Okay, this is true. This is 100% true. Like the indoctrination that goes on college campuses, and even at the high school level, and it to some degree elementary school, even now, which is really ramped up in the last few years. Um, it's it's tangible. You can see it pretty much anywhere you go, unless you live in an exceedingly conservative rural area. And even in those rural areas, like where I am, there are still pockets of uh, people who will gently call progressive. Um, this is not something that seems negative until you put those beliefs that you've been indoctrinated with into practice. But the romantic model that these men are talking about, that Paul Elam is referencing, precludes the Marxist and communist indoctrination by several decades, if not a few hundred years. So I would just like to point that out, that with or without communism, we would still have an issue with women preferring the romantic model. And maybe I'll have to talk with Paul or make a video of my own about why the romantic model is problematic for women. And we do have Valentine's Day coming up. I know, ladies, that Valentine's Day is probably one of the most important days of the year for a lot of women. And you are either in a make or break situation with your relationship, or you have a healthy, quote unquote, relationship that is, quote unquote, romantic, and you guys are getting ready to celebrate, or you're not in a relationship at all, and you're looking at people that have these relationships where they are positively celebrating Valentine's Day, and you are envying them or wishing you were in their position, or you may be a little bit bitter and you're terming it something else like Galentine's Day, and your plan is to go drink with your friends and maybe go get into some trouble. Who knows? But what if there was a secret fourth option that didn't include having a bunch of unrealistic expectations and a series of disappointments from not having those expectations met? All right, so let's keep going.
Like it's a few paragraphs, but I can read you the part of that paper that discusses romantic love. So I'll go ahead and just share my screen here real quick. So you can see right here, here is his process that he outlines is the step-by-step for how romantic love comes in. But what I'll do is I'll step it back a bit. However, beyond the various aspects of modernization, which have been discussed, I believe that the major challenge to the dowry system in Cyprus is a mere byproduct of modernization, namely the concept of romantic love. The concept of romantic love is not necessarily a part of the modernization process, but it has developed in Cyprus as a challenge to the dowry system, as if it were. The ideology of modernization, especially among the youth, includes a rejecting of the dowry system and parentally arranged marriages because they are thought to be at variance with the concept of romantic love. Cypriot youth have been exposed to a Western European view of romantic love through the movies and the mass media, through British influences on the island, and through exposure to foreign cultures in pursuit of their college education. First, the youth of Cyprus are very familiar with American and Western European cultural heroes, movies, pop music, and popular magazines, all of which have a strong romantic love emphasis. Second, during the time Cyprus was a British colony between 1895 and 1960, many of the British cultural ideas like romantic love were idealized by Cypriots because they were thought to be part of a modern and progressive society. This is certainly not to say that Greeks have given up their Greek identity, far from it, but rather that they identified certain of their traditional customs as being at odds with the modernization, which they believed was good and perhaps inevitable. Third, since Cyprus does not have a four-year college or university, this is back in 1975, large numbers of students obtain their college training in England and other Western countries. Since the students are at their most marriageable age while they are in these countries, it is not surprising that they would be influenced by Western European ideas about marriage and mate selection. And then here he gives his sort of step-by-step process of how this changes generationally.
Yeah, let's go through that.
Okay. The concept of romantic love, however, does not necessarily provide a conscious challenge to the dowry system. Youth that hold to the concept of romantic love may engage in an almost unconscious behavioral process which lead them to conclusions which are a challenge to the dowry system. The process may be outlined in the following sequential stages. Unmarried youth will accept the concept that two people should be romantically in love before they are married. Number two, unmarried youth will come to believe that they themselves are the ones who...
Okay, so that first paragraph, unmarried youth will accept the concept that two people should be romantically in love before they are married. This was something that was not traditionally practiced for the majority of human history. And you can look at that and say, well, that's why everybody was so miserable and dysfunctional, and men were abusing their wives, and that's why we needed feminism to stop this because uh, it arranged marriage and the dowry system it contributes to abuse and domestic violence. Can you imagine, ladies, if you were matched up with someone who on paper was completely compatible with you on multiple levels and someone that you would find physically attractive? Would you be unwilling to marry that person if you didn't have the prerequisites that the romantic model requires you have, i.e., under believing that you need to have premarital sex in order to determine if you are quote unquote sexually compatible, requiring a man to meet all of your emotional needs when most women are completely unaware or uninterested in meeting men's emotional needs unless they're being manipulative. And I'm sorry, ladies, a lot of women, a lot of us don't see that particular paradigm of the romantic model as and our behavior within it as being manipulative, but it is. And we can understand that it is because even though women don't like to listen to men, men are saying that they feel manipulated. And if men are saying they feel something, and it is almost across the board throughout the culture, regardless of what country you live in, then maybe it has some validity. And the only reason women don't want to hear it is because they're not actually interested in meeting a man's emotional needs as the reciprocal of having their needs met. Let's keep going.
who can best determine if romantic love is present in a relationship. Number 3, unmarried youth will come to believe that quote unquote love detection is most effectively accomplished within a social environment where they can become acquainted with persons of the opposite sex. Although parents may initially be willing to permit this with the person who has been selected as a potential marriage partner, youth will eventually assert that quote unquote love detection demands that they be able to gain the acquaintance of a number of persons of the opposite sex. This is made all the more inevitable by the development of a rational emphasis in the Western concept of romantic love, whereby it is felt that compatibility of personality characteristics should be a part of the mate selection process. Thus, unmarried youth will want the freedom to become acquainted with members of the opposite sex for the dual purpose, which actually will become a single process of detecting the presence of love in personality compatibility. It is at this stage in the process that the Western concept of dating begins, a stage which Cyprus seems to be in at the present time. One of the major points of disagreement between parents and children presently is over the amount of freedom which teenagers should be allowed to have outside of the home. The control of the main...
Okay. So, did you hear what Shaw said? He read this to you in plain language, and there should be nothing for you to get upset about because we're actually living in the after effects of this. But basically, what that paragraph is saying is that the romantic model encourages people, not just women, but men and women, to forego the traditional method of creating solid family units through marriage and opening the doors to what has essentially become nothing but glorified prostitution and fornication. You are no longer required by society's progressive expectations to rely on or depend upon the good sense of the people who have your best interests in mind. No, you are more qualified as a teenager to determine who is compatible with you based upon socializing and crossing boundaries that traditionally would have been completely taboo for you to cross. And it's gotten to the point now where parents will say, well, we can't really even stop our kids from having sex. We should just, let your daughter's boyfriend sleep at our house and he can even be in her bedroom with her and he's here for 3 or 4 days. And then when something inevitable happens, like a teen pregnancy, then you call it a quote unquote accident. Even though you go to school and you learn in health education, sex ed, or whatever your junior high termed the class exactly where babies come from. You know for a fact that you have intercourse, that the sperm enters the woman's body and fertilizes an egg during ovulation, and that is how a baby is created. And so logically, you would think that the way to prevent an unwanted pregnancy would be not to engage in the activity that would create that pregnancy. Instead, they tell you that, oh, well, you can't really help it. It's just an accident. Have some condoms. And if those don't work, you can always get on birth control. And if birth control doesn't work, you can always get an abortion. That's a bunch of extra steps that don't need to be there if you wanted to prevent your child or yourself or a friend of yours from making the kinds of mistakes that directly influence not only your life, but the lives of your offspring and your entire immediate family and sometimes extended family members over multiple generations now. So let's continue.
Mate selection process will pass from the hands of the parents to the hands of unmarried youth. When 2 unmarried youth believe...
Yeah, so passing the process of mate selection from the parents to the hands of unmarried youth. Like, Do you know what that means? That means that your parents are no longer responsible for your well being, that you are now the determining factor of whether or not you're doing the right thing for yourself, even though you have no life experience to draw from to determine whether or not you're making the decision. And your brain and body is flooded with hormones that override any cognitive functions that you may have in the moment. So it's just interesting. It's just very, very interesting that we would then look at some, like a family member, like your father or your mother, and say that if they saw you with someone that they did not approve of, or they noticed that this person was having a negative effect in your life, that they are being controlling if they tell you that you can't see that person anymore. And parents have a real fear of not only their child. If you are a parent, you'll attest to this. Everyone has a fear that your child will either end up getting into trouble, or if you push them too hard to make a different decision, they're just going to rebel, and it's going to make it 10,000 times worse. And so they just let you do whatever you're going to do. And a lot of people end up ruining their lives because of this mentality that, oh, for some reason, I as a parent don't have the right to discipline my own child as they enter into puberty. And children will rebel against their parents because they don't believe that their parents need or deserve any respect or obedience, because they are now somehow mature enough to make these decisions because they've gone through puberty. If you were to encounter a person who has legitimately traditional parents, who legitimately had a roster of potentially good matches that your new acquaintance chose from and selected a mate from, and they orchestrated between the two families a union that resulted in a marriage, you would look at them and you would question their sanity. You would question whether or not they were being abused, or they were a victim of misogyny, even though objectively you could look at them and see that they had exponentially better outcomes, projected outcomes, than someone who goes about it the quote unquote old fashioned way and like bar hops to meet quote unquote the one. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Appreciate ya. Vivian Benesia signing out.